because you're hosting. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, awesome. Alrighty.
Cool. Let's get started then. Hi everyone. For the sake of recording, and anyone who doesn't know me, my name's Dan. I used to go to Macquarie, and now go to Sydney. I'm in my third year of debating. I've done a little bit at this point. As Sam kind of politely shouted out in the Facebook, I was the fifth best reply speaker at Australs last year. So hopefully have some idea of what I'm talking about when it comes to replies. And so we're here to talk about them. So replies are something that are a little bit strange. They're a little bit different to how other speeches have worked, and they're often something that I think speakers struggle with in a kind of less experience than they otherwise would be. And so a lot of this presentation is going to be kind of introducing how to think about replies, how to engage them in a way that I guess means that you can maximize their utility within debates. This isn't going to be, just as a kind of preface, this isn't going to be like a super example heavy reply. There are kind of other seminars on YouTube that give kind of more breakdowns of very analytically, specifically how to do replies and give kind of worked examples of that. This is going to be kind of a more general conception. Obviously, happy to answer questions if you have them. But otherwise, this will be more theory. If you want examples of good replies, look at them online. There's heaps of them there. I'll tell you some good ones to look at later. Cool. The first thing I'm going to, hang on, how do I move this? There we go. The first thing I want to do is a brief caveat about replies in general, which is as much as this advice is going to try and be super applicable and super useful, there are lots of good ways to give a reply. And ultimately, a good reply depends a lot on the debate that you're giving the reply about. So different debates are going to call for different types of replies. Replies can be very different in a debate where you're winning by like a million points before you even get to a reply versus one where you're really probably losing a debate versus one where it's very close and very hotly contested and that reply perhaps makes a really big difference on the debate. And so whilst this is going to be a lot of general principles, whenever you're in the position of giving the reply, you should always be thinking about what is the position of the debate you're in and what you think is kind of the maximum way to get utility out of reply. And we'll explain a little bit what that looks like. So let's get started by talking about what reply speeches are in general, just to reiterate the basics for anyone who's kind of unsure. The first thing to note about reply speech is they're a half-length speech, so they're 4 minutes, and they occur at the end of the debate, and the order is swapped. So you have the negative reply go first and the affirmative reply. So to give our look the order, it's the same as we did at Easters with first affirmative, first negative, etc., all the way up to third negative. Then immediately after third negative sits down, the negative reply will get up, give their speech, and then afterwards the affirmative reply will follow through, and the debate will finish after that. The other thing to note about the reply is it's given by either the first speaker or the second speaker. So it's not given by a new speaker, it's an additional responsibility on top of what you are already doing. And we'll explain a little bit later on about how you might want to make that choice and exactly how it might be a little bit different between giving a reply at first or second, because there are some differences you might want to pay attention to. But broadly depends on teams as to who is kind of doing what there. The other thing to note is that replies are, because they're half the length, they're scored as a judge at half of that. So they're scored between 35 and 40. So you take the regular speaker score that you would give to the reply and you would divide it by 2. So if you think a reply would get a 77 on the normal Austral speaker scale, you would divide it by 2 and you would give it 38.5. Really, really importantly, and that's why it's in all capitals, you should not minus 40 when you're doing a reply. This is a habit that is referred to when judges, instead of choosing to, I guess, engage in things and do the proper division by 2, they be lazy, they cut it in 2. And the problem with that is really simple. It's just that it means it gives you the wrong score. If you give a reply at 37, that is not giving it a 77, that's giving it a 34. This happens at Australs all the time. Many people have been cut by it and get very upset by it. I thankfully was quite lucky that I didn't get minus 40 at Australs, but plenty of people do. If you're judging, always pay attention, always double check your maths. It's a good thing to avoid. Many reply speakers will be very, very thankful to you for that. 2 other things to note very briefly about judging replies, and I'll talk a little bit more about how you judge replies towards the end of this presentation. But the main things to keep in mind is it's scored independently from a prior substantive speech. So someone could have given like an absolutely terrible first affirmative, but maybe their affirmative reply was really, really good. And maybe they give an excellent first affirmative, but their reply just kind of does nothing for the debate. So the reply is its own thing. Even if the same speaker is giving it, you don't consider up at all what their prior speech was like when weighing up the reply. And even though replies are a little bit different how they operate, they're still judged off persuasiveness and importance, kind of the 2 metrics we'd normally consider when looking holistically at what makes a good speech. So what actually is a reply in terms of as a speech? The purpose of reply is fairly straightforward. It's a biased adjudication. So what you're trying to do at reply is you're giving a retrospective look at the debate. The debate's happened, you're sitting back and you're accounting for what's happened in the debate and trying to explain to the judge why that should result in your team winning. And I think a really good way of framing this, and this is not an analogy that I took, I believe Jordan Gibson's the first person I heard describe it like this, but think of it as if you're a panelist on an adjudication panel and you're really trying to convince the chair as to why they should adopt your call. So you're trying to convince them to flip their call. How would you go about doing that? That's kind of how you want to think about as a reply. You're ultimately kind of launching an appeal to the panel, suggesting why it is you should win. And that means that unlike most speeches, when you're arguing about the motion and why your side of the motion is correct, with a reply, you're actually not arguing about the motion. You're arguing about the debate and you're arguing about why your team should win the debate. So in that sense, it's quite a bit more meta than other kinds of speeches are, because you're not engaging in analytical argumentation in the pursuit of furthering your side of the motion. You're arguing in pursuit of furthering your team's position within the debate instead. And so it adopts language at times that might be familiar. For those of you who have done British parliamentary, which tends to be a lot more strategy heavy, replies in some way have more similarity to that. And so what that means is replies are kind of a fundamentally distinct skill from other speeches. There are plenty of really, really good speakers who kind of suck at doing replies or don't give replies very well, or struggle with them. And there are other speakers who might be a bit weak when it comes to other speeches, but can give really, really excellent replies. And on note, I think replies are a skill that actually quite correlates a lot to judging. So I find the better a judge is, often the better that makes your reply. Not always, but it's a useful thing to keep in mind. And in fact, if you're looking at how to get better at replies, judging is a really good way of doing that because it works on a lot of similar skills. Crucially, there's a couple of particular rules at reply that kind of help make it clear why it's a biased adjudication and not just a speech more normally. And that is the following. Firstly, you cannot give any new substantive material. This should be really obvious. You just can't make new arguments. A third can't make new arguments, presumably a speech after that also cannot make new arguments. But distinct from third is you also can't give new rebuttal. So you can't actually say anything that is new, whether constructive or deconstructive, in a reply. The two new things that you can do is you can give new framing and new weighing. I will explain a little bit more about what the distinction between those two is a little later on, because often people get those two things mixed up. But the way to think about it is that a good reply is very heavy on meta commentary. So in the same way that a good oral adjudication is going to give a lot of feedback, it's going to give a little bit of commentary on how persuasive they thought particular claims were in the debate. It's going to give a lot of analysis on why are particular things important within the debate and other things not so important. That's the type of way that a reply is going to look at the debate, as opposed to other speeches, which might occasionally adopt in that kind of language, but it's certainly not the focus of what they're trying to do. The last point I want to make under briefly the content, so I guess the nature of replies, is a really important one, which is that a reply is not a summary of the debate. And this, I would say, is the number one mistake, and certainly one that I made when I started to give replies, that people who are new to the act of giving replies make all of the time. A reply is not a summary of the debate. And the reason why it's not a summary actually should be relatively obvious. It's that the judge has already kind of written everything down on their paper, right? The debate has happened. The judge was there. Presumably they were listening. And everyone else was in the debate and everyone has heard the debate. And so repeating your team's case or summarizing what happened in the debate as a whole at reply isn't really useful because it's not giving anything new. So even though there's all these rules about not being able to introduce new material into reply, you still want the reply speech itself to be new, but the type of new you're still contributing is less. You're less contributing new content and more kind of contributing, I guess, new thoughts or new ways of looking at the debate. And the key separation point between the best replies and not so good replies is the not so good replies will frequently indulge in kind of replaying what's happened in the debate and summarizing things that were happened, whereas the best replies will do a lot less of that and a lot more of commentating and observing things. The other reason that's not written onto the slide as to why this is the case is like a reply is only 4 minutes. And if you do the math on how long an Australs debate is up until the reply portion, it's like 48 minutes. And trying to condense 48 minutes content down into 4 minutes is a bit of a foolish exercise. And so I would suggest in that sense alone, if the purpose of a reply is to just summarize the debate as it happened, it's not going to do that very effectively. And so you want to be thinking more broadly about specifically thinking of a reply as a biased way of describing how your team would win the debate. And that's ultimately what it should do. Reply at the end, you should be able to sit down after the reply, and the judge should be convinced that by your reply and that your side has won the debate. Now, I do want to briefly ask the question of are replies actually useful? Because one thing that gets kind of litigated a lot within debate discourse is the idea that replies are kind of useless. They just make debates a little bit longer. Judges have already written this stuff down. They've kind of already decided what the result is. You can't actually make any new material. And if your case sucked, a reply is probably not going to fix it. And if you're willing by like a million points, a reply is not probably going to change that. And so there's a lot of people who think that replies are kind of a bit silly. They're not super helpful and they're not something you want to engage in a lot. And I would suggest the critics of reply perhaps have some merits. It's definitely true that the scope of reply is probably more limited than other speeches. It's half the length. So to that extent, I guess you could view it as having half the ability to kind of change the outcome of the debate in the same way. And certainly if you're losing a debate by a lot, it's unlikely that a reply is going to help you win. But I would suggest replies actually are very important and very useful, and particularly in tournament settings, as opposed to just individual debates. When you're going through a tournament like Australs, for example, replies become really, really critical over the course of the tournament in ensuring that not just that your team does well in individual debates, but over the course of a tournament, your team performs to a very high standard. And the reason for that is a reply is kind of a unique chance to talk directly to the judge and try and shift their perspective on the debate. Because if you think about other speeches in the debate, they're trying to convince judge of things, they're trying to forward material, they're trying to prove things. But they're arguing that all along the lines of proving why it's kind of good for the motion. But it's not really talking to the judge in direct detail about how the debate itself is playing out and how it's operating. Teams will venture into that commentary at times, but it's not the focus of the speech. Whereas that actually is the focus of the speech that you reply. You're trying to talk to the judge almost in a one-on-one and be like, hey, here's why we won the debate. Here's why we're pretty good. You should give the win to us. And so that means that there's really two things a reply can do that are super impactful. The first is it can flip close calls. There are absolutely debates where if they are close enough, the way you perceive a debate, it's kind of the debates where you think about that they're close and there's potentially multiple correct reads of a debate. In those kinds of debates, replies are super critical at getting judges to believe that the interpretations of the debate where you win are more plausible than the interpretations where you don't. And I would suggest, particularly if you're in debates which have panels, which is quite common at Australs, that you might have, a chair and two panelists or a chair and one panelist, being able to convince not just one or two people in the panel, but most of the panel that you've won a debate is something a reply is really, really good at doing because they can sort through the mess of a debate in a way that other speeches aren't always able to effectively. The other thing, and the thing that matters a lot in the context of a tournament, I guess, as opposed to individual debates, is that replies are really good at increasing your margin of victory or shrinking the margin of defeat. Because what a reply does is it's challenging a judge's understanding of the debate as a whole. And so in that sense, if you encourage a judge to look at a debate differently, consider claims maybe they'd forgotten about or didn't think were super important, and you provide the reasoning as to why those things are super important, it can really change the way your case is perceived overall within the round. And that can do things like not just give you very good reply speaks, but also change the speaks of the rest of your team such that you recontextualize certain speeches so that they seem much better than the judge maybe previously thought they did, for example. And in the course of tournaments, when things like a break often happens on the basis of speaks, or even just when kind of individual rankings happen on that basis. Like, I guess the good thing is like, look at Easters, you can get 4 wins, but that doesn't say guarantee you might break, for example. It's really, really helpful to be able to increase margins as much as you can to kind of maximize your chance of doing those things. Or even just to kind of, when you look at the ranks at the end, you kind of have done a bit better. And you've made debates closer than they otherwise could have been. So it's just a good thing for your team in general to be able to try and, even if it's already a guarantee if you've won or lost the debate, to try and make it as close or as far apart as possible, depending on if you're winning or losing. And the mark of the best replies that you'll hear iterated pretty consistently is the best replies will be when the reply is given, and then when the judge gets up to give the OA, they just repeat like a longer version of that reply. That's kind of the mark is when you're speaking reply, you've really nailed it because you've given a conception of the debate that maybe isn't the most accurate, but it's the one that the judge has bought and believed, and has been really crucial in shifting their understanding in such a way you win the debate. So yes, I think we should be realistic about what replies can accomplish. They can't necessarily make you win from nowhere unless you're incredibly, incredibly talented replies and huge degrees of black magic or like a debate set up in a very particular way. But they do impact the way we perceive and understand debates. And in that sense, they're very, very critical. Cool. The next thing we're going to do in this presentation is we're going to talk about, now that we kind of understand what replies are in general, what the components of a good reply are. And I would broadly suggest there's three of them. Firstly, the mentality of how you go about constructing a reply. Secondly, the kind of form or the structure of that reply. And finally, the actual content you have within that reply. Here actually might be a good point for a moment. If anyone has any questions, Sam, can you ever just run them over and type them in the Zoom chat? Or I guess messaging on Facebook is fine too. If anyone does have any, because this is probably a good point to stop and make sure we all understand everything before moving on. So are there any questions? Is that a nope or a yes? We'll find out. Cool.
All good for now.
Okay, fantastic. That's wonderful to hear. So let's go and break it down then piece by piece. The first thing to think about is the mentality of a reply. And I think the single most useful way you can perceive a reply is just to think that at third negative, the debate is actually over. And at that point, what's happened has happened. And there's kind of an allusion to this in the way that some judges will describe a debate. So if you've ever been judged by Rob Barry in an Australs round, what he'll always do is he'll note that we'll now transition into the reply portion of this debate. And I think that's actually a really useful way of thinking about it. It's like a different section of the debate. The debate that's happened is over, and what's happening in the reply portion is quite different. And it's more of a, rather than a debate, a kind of review or critique of what's happened. So we use that word earlier to suggest it's kind of retrospective. We're looking back on the debate. But I think it's a useful way of thinking that's what you're doing. You're analyzing something that's already happened and just trying to, almost like you were writing kind of a movie review. Like the movie's out, you can't change it, but you can certainly change how people perceive it and how people think about it. And I think that's a really good way at reply of thinking about the debate in such a way that avoids you from stepping into the worst pitfalls. Because if you view the debate as already over, you're way less likely to try and do things like put new rebuttal into the debate or overstep, I guess, the margin of newness that we would consider kind of bad at reply. And that's really difficult to do. Like sometimes if third negative got up and said something like really, really dumb, there's often a really strong temptation to just rebut it in the reply. Don't do that. It's not going to be helpful. It's not going to be credited. And I think viewing the debate as over, you can't contribute anything to it in that sense, but you can shift the way the debate is perceived, is a really useful mental way of encouraging you to think about, well, if I can't directly rebut that claim, what are other ways that I can maybe deal with that claim such that it's not going to be important in the debate? So very much what you're doing is you're sifting through kind of the messiness and ambiguity of a debate rather than contributing to it. You want to identify what's important and how that benefits your team. And I think a lot of this is that the best replies engage in like a very high degree of realism. You usually don't want in a reply to just be like so high off your own like skill that you're like, I'm amazing, we've absolutely won this debate. Because that's really unconducive to you giving a really strong reply. You want to think about realistically, where are we sitting in the debate? What can reasonably be changed about the judge's mind? And how can I kind of go about doing that? So it requires you to be very evaluative and reflective on the debate as it's happening. However, that being said, why you should be realistic in terms of identify what's important, how that can be made to benefit your team, and you shouldn't just like totally lie or make things up. It's really important to approach a reply as if you are going to win the debate. Because if a reply isn't coming across as you thought you won, at that point, a judge can kind of read the vibes of that. And it's like, oh, well, there's no way they've won then. You want to always make sure that you're pushing some degree of doubt into the judge's mind, maximizing kind of your own chances of winning. And so the question to ask in a reply that's really, really helpful is, if the judge was going to give us the win, how would they go about justifying it? So if you imagine that you've done the replies, you've stepped out of the room, OA's happening, and the OA was going to give you the win, how would that judge have gone about justifying you winning the debate? And that's kind of what you want to do at reply. You're trying to get in the mentality of, I'm justifying, maybe there's only one way that you could win the debate. And if that's the case, your reply should be entirely focused around, here's the one way we could plausibly win the debate, and I'm going to make sure it's the one way the judge believes they should read the debate. Even if there's like 10 ways the other team could win the debate, That doesn't matter if they believe that the way the debates happen is the way we win. The other two things to keep in mind with reply is that you really want to try and avoid excessive repetition and summary. In the same way that when you're listening to an OA, I notice for example, get really, really bored if all an OA is doing is just kind of explaining what's happened in the debate and doesn't really give much value of commentary. It's like, yeah, I heard this. I don't care. Tell me why we won or why we lost. That's the same thing with reply. You do, to some extent, need to go back and summarize parts of the debate. Like you need to probably talk about specific claims that are made or what the important contentions are. But the same way as an OA, you don't need to litigate that out in all its detail. Give the detail that's relevant. You give the things that are needed to understand the read of the debate. But that's the maximum you want to do. You want to focus on that evaluative component of the giving reasons why you're winning or why you're losing or why things are important, far more than you do on the here's what's happened. The other thing you really need to keep in mind for the mentality of reply is you need to be really precise and really focused. 4 minutes is not a lot of time, particularly when you've had quite a lot of the debate go through, and there's often a lot of things that you'll want to do in a reply. And so, because 4 minutes is so brief, prioritization is really, really important. You want to think about what can I realistically achieve within this reply and focus on doing that. And that's probably what I would say is kind of the second big mistake a lot of beginning reply speakers make. It's that you bite off more than you can chew. And the problem with that when it comes to replies is the more that you're trying to do, the less likely any one thing you're going to try to do is going to be able to land. And so it's always better to reply to try and focus on doing less things, but focus on doing them as effectively as you can. And this is why I think it's really helpful to think of it as a review or a critique rather than necessarily speech from the debate, because you're not trying to summarize everything. You don't need to mention every single element of what happened. Just pick the parts that are relevant and going to be the most useful to your speech, prioritize working on those, and it's probably going to mean you'll be able to accomplish those things substantially more effectively. Cool. Second thing to talk about then, assuming you've got a very good mentality for reply, you know you're trying to anchor around, explain how you've won the debate, do all the stuff we kind of talked about here. You know your reply is all going to be about, I've got to be concise and I've got to concisely explain to the judge, here's the reason why you should give the debate to us. How do we structure a reply? And this, I would say, is probably the most daunting element of replies to newer speakers. Because I can tell you, to cows come home, I guess, what you're trying to convince the judge why you should win, et cetera, et cetera. But how you structure that, obviously, is really, really important in making sure that your ideas come across clearly, the judge is going to believe them. And it's something that's a little bit tricky. The first thing I would note about how you structure a reply is it is actually really flexible. And I would say it's probably more flexible than any other speech you could possibly give. Because a good reply structure is ultimately whatever helps you clearly explain why your team won. And if you watch videos of replies, you'll see there's often a lot of diversity. Sometimes you'll have a reply where a speaker will go out and give a 2-minute introduction that fundamentally changes the way you see the debate in a way that's really profound. Other speakers won't give an introduction, they'll just go straight into litigating kind of how a speech comes about. And so, really, if it's going to help your team win, it's not a bad way of structuring the reply. There might be better ways, but it's not a bad way if it's helping explain that. Broadly speaking, though, I would say there's 2 primary ways that you can structure a reply. And it's either you center the speech around your team's content or you center it around the opposition's. So the 2 ways that looks like are relatively simple. First way you can do it is you can center the speech around your content. So for example, there are 2 ways we win this debate. Firstly, we explain a principal harm if this policy was to occur, which is XYZ. And secondly, we explain that it would particularly harm these vulnerable groups who we deeply care about and whose quality of life would meaningfully detract from this. So those are the 2, I guess, central claims of your case. And the way you would litigate each one is be like, we explain this. The opposition provides 3 responses to this. First, to say this, second this, third this. So you're prioritizing, here's what we prove, here's how the opposition team tries to overcome it, and here's why they ultimately fail and don't succeed in doing that. And so the premises that we tried to prove, in fact, stand at the end of the debate. This is sometimes referred to just as like a reply. It's like, this reply is explaining why we win the debate. The other way of doing it is you can do the inverse of that. It's you can do the opposition try to win this debate in 3 ways. Firstly, this, secondly, this, and thirdly, this. And then the reply is going through and explaining why the responses that your team gives are capable of overcoming those reasons. So you'd be like, so therefore, at the end of this reply, you should believe neither this, this, or this. And so if the other team cannot win the debate, you must give the win to us. There's different theories about when each speech is useful. Some would tell you that it's really helpful if you're winning a debate and you're trying to margin stack, you should lead with the opposition's case and focus around the various ways you defeat them. Some would say that if it's a really close debate, you should prioritize your own material and show how the opposition fails to get around it. And those things are correct. My approach is actually a little bit different. I think broadly, if you're on the affirmative team, you should do this first structure where you should center it around the content in your speech and then how the opposition team engages with that. And if you're negative, you should do the opposite. You should start with the opposition's content and then how you're able to overcome it. The reason for that is that provides a very narrativized and chronological way of looking at debate, which is really, really helpful. But ultimately, your mileage may vary. Either way is a way that works. There are other ways you can do it as well, but that's kind of the two broad classes that things reply into. Those kind of sections of the speech then, where you're talking about the important parts of your content or the important parts of the opposition content, are anchored around win conditions. And so in that sense, a reply can be you can think of it, if you're really struggling to conceptualize it, as it's similar to a third speaker speech, where there, you might have three issues in debate. And you'd be like, first is principle, second is the harm to this stakeholder, and the second is harm to this other stakeholder, for example. However, I would suggest the way you think about, I guess, your headings for each part of the speech for reply to be very distinct from the clashes and themes you would run at third. Because when I'm talking about win conditions, what I mean specifically is kind of like, what are the things in the debate that are really, really crucial to believing your side of the case or believing that the other team's side is really, really bad? And so rather than a clash or theme, which is often trying to be more broader and more retrospective, you want to think it's about, in terms of proving the overall outcome we're trying to prove in this debate, how do we go about doing that? What are the premises maybe that a judge is really going to need to believe to do that? And so these questions can either be really broad or really narrow. It's going to depend on the debate, but you want to make it really clear why the question it is you're asking matters in the grand scheme of the debate. So sometimes, in simpler debates, certainly, you want those questions to line up with what a judge would be seeing the debate in terms of clashes. It'd be very similar to maybe a third speech, or the judge is like, there are two questions I had in this debate. But sometimes it might be more useful to be really narrow and focus on proving really specific premises, particularly if you're behind a debate or if the debate is close. It can be helpful to focus on those kind of smaller but really high impact questions in the debate. The other thing I would note, irrespective of how you choose to structure your speech, whether you're focusing on the opposition's material or your material as kind of the basis to your structure, or exactly what the headings or themes are of your speech, and obviously they'll vary a lot debate to debate, I would never do more than two, and I think it's totally valid to do one. That's the reason I said earlier, less is more. The less time you spend in your speech, the more important it is. But also, sometimes, especially for kind of the last ditch replies, it's far more tactical to spend a lot of your time trying to convince the judge here's this one really crucial way we win the debate and then explain why everything else is unimportant than it is to try and win on every single battleground in the debate. Because especially if the debate is close, you're probably not winning everything. So you should focus on, here are the things we're winning. Here's why those things are more important than everything else in the debate. And that's often a far more persuasive way of structuring a reply. The other thing I'd note, and this is perhaps a slightly more unpopular take, not everyone would agree on this, but I think introductions are a really, really good idea in replies. And the reason for that is an introduction and a reply lets you kind of prime the judge as to how they should go about interpreting your case and your reply in a way that I think is really useful. I do think you need to be careful with doing introductions or reply. You need to be significantly more disciplined than you would in any other speech, because you don't have time to waste in a 4-minute speech. So they should be very focused and laser precise. You should be getting up and you should know exactly what your introduction is. You should know how long it's going to take. And you should know why you're doing it. And in fact, I would really suggest if you are a reply speaker and you're doing an introduction, set a time limit on your reply. So maybe if it's a really, really cracking introduction and you think it's really going to sell the reply, maybe you can have it go for like a minute. But for the average reply introduction, no more than 30 seconds is what I would suggest. I think this is particularly important in affirmative reply for reasons we'll talk about in a little bit. But I think negative reply, you're immediately following up your third negative speaker. You don't need to do as much priming because third neg has probably done some of that for you. But especially in affirmative reply, it's helpful to kind of reiterate your case a little bit. Ultimately, though, the way to think about reply structure is really simple. If a reply is all about convincing the judge why you win the debate, the structure of your reply should reflect the strategy as to how you're intending to prove that. And so your reply structure is naturally going to vary between debates. You might have preferences as to how you do it or patterns of how you do it, but I would be really against having a very fixed kind of reply structure because the best replies are the ones that are super dynamic, the ones that adapt to the debate they're in specifically. And so unlike a first speaker speech where often people have very set ways of doing it, and that makes sense because it's a bit more replicable in some senses, reply more so than any other position, you're really structuring it based on here's how the debate's happening, here's what I'm specifically trying to do. And so if it isn't obvious by now, one thing that's super important in replies is having a lot of clarity and having a really strong understanding of what it is you're trying to do. And if you've got that, that's probably the most important thing in reply. Your execution might be off, but if you've got kind of a really strong conception of what the reply is trying to do, you're probably half of the way there. Cool. The final feature of a good reply is content. There are broadly two things you need to keep in mind then with the content of a reply, because they're relatively simple in that sense. The first is you need a really clear and realistic strategy. So what can you actually persuade the judge of? I don't think it's useful in a reply to be overly optimistic about what you can do and kind of go out on a limb and try to prove something kind of totally insane that's not in the debate, or say that another team has completely failed to do something when it's not the case at all. But I think it is useful to kind of break it down into two really simple questions that the strategy of a reply should ask. The first is just what has been proven or is still unproven in the debate, and why is or isn't that debate winning? And that ultimately is how you're going to kind of anchor your whole reply. So if you've got two questions in the reply and they're two different win conditions for your team, all you're really doing is you're like, here are the main premises that we give you under this issue. Here's how the other team responds to them. Here's why they don't work. And so we have, in fact, proven those premises. And here's why that wins us the debate. That's kind of the three things you're doing. What do we say? Why did the opposition's responses not work? Why do we then win the debate because of that? Or the inverse. What does the opposition say? How do we defeat it? Why does that mean they can't win the debate? That is a really simple way, I guess, of thinking about your microstructure within each kind of section of your speech, if you want a super, super template-style way of going about doing it. But content-wise, those are the two questions you're focused on the reply. Is it proven? Is it debate winning? If the answer is yes to both of them for your side, you're probably doing pretty well. If it's not, you want to think about maybe how you can go about making sure that you can actually persuade those things. The other thing I would note is that the majority of your speech should be new meta commentary. So you should be trying to make as much of a contribution to the reply as you can. And there's kind of 4 different things you can do to help you do that. I'll note, obviously, this won't be 100% of the speech. You do need to reference some stuff that other speakers say. You need to make sure that you're not just saying stuff and the judge doesn't understand where it came out in the debate or where it's coming from or what you're talking about. But in terms of what the analytical meat of the reply should be, should largely be focused on these 4 things. The first thing is framing, and this is the thing I think introductions are really useful for. So framing, as how I see it, and there's a lot of discourse on like, is framing and weighing just the same thing? Are they different? Whatever. The way I distinguish them, framing is just what is relevant to the debate and how you should perceive things within the debate. So because it's framing, the best way to view it is view it as like a little picture frame. So currently you see my whole room, but if I make the frame smaller, you'll be focusing on just me. And that's kind of how you want to think about a reply. When you're framing a reply and you're trying to explain why you should win the debate, the easiest way to make it really clear why you should win the debate is move the frame of the debate such that the thing you're focusing on is the thing that's kind of only important for your case, or like where your case's material is kind of the strongest. So if you could redirect where the judge's attention in the debate, what they believe is important within the debate, to the stuff that your material is the best at, and it's the strongest compared to the opposition's, that's going to put you in a really good position. So that's the first type of thing you want to do. And this is things to kind of make that more specific. It's like, what are the most important contexts in the debate? Which stakeholders do we care about the most? What outcomes are we the most concerned with in this debate? Those kind of questions and why we should care about those things are really useful things you can do. And I said earlier, you can do new framing. So you absolutely can kind of add some stuff that extends upon your team's case, but might not have been explicitly said in kind of earlier speakers. And so that's the first thing that you can do from a content perspective. The second thing is impacting. So you can't do new impacting, but you can obviously offer explanations of existing impacts in ways that might not have been done before. this is really simple. What are the harms and benefits in your case that actually stuck? And a lot of your reply is going to be trying to explain at the end of the debate, here are the harms we landed or the benefits we landed, and here's why that matters. And the reason for this is really simple. If you think about the best oral adjudications you've ever got, the best judges always judge a debate off impacts. Because at the end of the day, that's the thing that matters. You might win a debate because your characterization is more persuasive or you've mechanized something a lot more clearly. But the reason those things matter is because at the end of the day, it's helped you prove particular outcomes. Because the way that a judge judges a debate is always kind of between these two worlds, the affirmative and the negative, which would I rather live in? And the way you decide that is, well, which world tangibly or principally is better? And that's all harms, benefits, and I guess kind of MISC principle stuff. And so making sure in your reply that it's really clear that you're focusing around the impacts you're proving is super, super important. The third is weighing. This is just when you kind of engage the impacts and framing comparatively against what the other team says, right? So comparatively, why is your conception of a particular actor's characterization more important? Or why are the impact or more persuasive? Or why are the impacts that you've proven more important than the impacts that other teams have proven, for example? That I hope is relatively straightforward. And the final thing, and the thing that is probably the most distinct between reply and other types of speakers, is having a lot of strategic analytical observations. And these are kind of the same comments that a judge might make. So for example, identifying when an argument is kind of poorly proven or resting on really shaky characterization, or noting where, for example, the scope of a particular argument is really limited, or where a team maybe under-explained particular kinds of impacts, or even just observing how arguments engage to each other. So like this argument from the other team might be true, but if it's true in a very limited number of contexts because it rests on this premise. Whereas our argument is true in way more contexts because we don't rely on that particular assumption, for example. So that's the kinds of stuff you can do in terms of being really kind of comparative in terms of how it works out. And a lot of that is really useful in making the reply more persuasive because it gives you the kind of more of a facade of neutrality. You're just making observations about the debate. And often that's the type of thing in terms of strategic and analytical observations that will make judges reconsider and question particular material. So if you can make a comment, for example, it's like, yeah, this is a really persuasive argument, but it only works if you believe this characterization. And I've just explained to you why that doesn't make any sense, which means that it's unclear if they get this impact. That's the sort of thing that makes judges perhaps reconsider material they otherwise hadn't, and that can be really helpful. Ultimately, the thing you're trying to do in a reply, to kind of boil that all down, is you're constructing a narrative of why your team wins. And there's different ways of doing that, but as I think is the case of kind of any good speech, a speech should tell a story. And the story that your reply wants to tell is just, why is it, given everything you've heard, where the side that should come through? And these are the different tools you can use as to how you go about doing that. Cool. The next stuff we're going to talk about is kind of less so the content and the stuff you would have in the reply, but how you actually go about doing a reply. So how you would write the reply, how you might want to deliver the reply, stuff like that. So this is like the physical mechanics of how you write a reply, because I've already explained kind of the stuff you'd ideally want in the reply. So there are broadly 4 things you should keep in mind here. The first, tracking is everything. So if you don't know what tracking means, that just refers to writing down what's happening in the debate, what speakers are saying. This is, I think, the single most important thing you can do for a reply. And that's really simple. The more detail you understand a debate in, the better the reply is going to be. Because the more depth you understand a debate in means the more you understand how arguments interact with each other, the more you kind of understand your own chances of winning and what material is landing, what material isn't, and understand like where is the opposition really strong, where are they comparatively weaker on. So the more detail you can remember a debate in, the better the reply is going to be. And this is a little bit in terms of how much tracking you need to do person to person. I know some speakers have very, very good memories, and so will track a little bit less. I personally have a horrifically bad memory in most facets of my life. And so what I personally do is I make sure that I track really rigorously in a debate. That every major claim that teams forward, I'm always writing it down. And making sure that at the very least, looking back on my notes, that I can understand what a speaker was saying at any point. And you should do this for not just the opposition team speakers, but also your own speakers. Because you should be in a reply, you're not giving rebuttal, right? You're leveraging the pieces from both teams in the debate. And so you want to understand what has your team given you that you can work with in the reply to help explain why you win, rather than just relying, for example, on other teams. And this is, like, I think, relatively intuitive. So if you're, for example, your third AF gives a really killer rebuttal to a particular claim from second negative, you might want to point out that that rebuttal in your affirmative reply actually deals with a bunch of other claims in the negative case, but maybe your third affirmative didn't make that connection. That's absolutely a connection that you could make. And so you can be like, we gave you this awesome response that was directed here, but also works against all these other things. And so you should believe it. That's the type of thing that you can do a lot more easily if you've tracked the debate in detail. In terms of when you should start tracking, really immediately after you finish your speech. Like, ideally, you're already kind of tracking before you when you should be writing down this. You should know what's in your own speech, obviously. You should know what's in the speech before you so you can respond to them. But really, the second that you sit down and you finish your speech, you should immediately start writing down the content for what's in the next speaker. And this is why general wisdom is reply is easier for first than second. Like, if you're in a series, if you're in like a mini or something, obviously there to have fun for the most part and get some practice and get some debates in. Doesn't really matter who speaks reply. But in a tournament context, unless if one of you is substantially better at reply, it's normally advisable for whoever's first to speak reply. Because at first, you've got a lot more time to kind of write things down and to stew and think about the debate from a more impartial lens than you do at second. I spoke, for context, second in reply at Australs, and I would really note that when I was second negative, I'd sit down third affirmative, third negative, and then I'd have to give the reply. So I would only have really 16 minutes to construct a reply speech, which is a lot less than if you're, for example, first affirmative, in which you have 5 speeches to do that, which is like 32 minutes. Like, it's, wait, no, hang on. 40 minutes, which is like more than double the length of time, right? So, especially if you're newer at reply and you're trying to get good, I would probably suggest speak first and reply, because it's a lot easier to control for in that sense than is it second, where you're a lot more under the pump. If you are speaking second and reply, my biggest piece of advice is make sure your tracking is really accurate for early speeches in the debate, perhaps more than otherwise would be. So that's like, if you're second negative, in prep, make sure you've already got a really specific idea of what your one end's written down. So you've already got that one end speech that your partner is going to give written out already, so you can save time during their speech. Make sure that you track the other 2 speeches from the affirmative, the first and second, really, really specifically, and that kind of will make it a lot easier for you. I'll note, I don't think second affirmative is too bad. Like, second affirmative is like, I doubt as hard to write a reply as first negative is. It's second negative that's kind of the really kind of crunch position for reply. So that's just a good thing to keep in mind. That's just going to impact how you need to think about tracking and making sure you're kind of balancing your priorities. Obviously, prioritize giving a good substantive speech. Like, if your reply is like excellent, but your like second is kind of bad, that's not really a worthwhile trade-off. Like, the second's going to do a lot more, it's a lot more valuable in the debate. But obviously, so I guess if you have to sack one, a worse reply is preferable to a worse second, but like, obviously you should try and be good for both. The last thing is, don't just track the specifics of what being said. As it's happening, you should, kind of in the same way that I would encourage people to judge, this isn't already how you judge, you should have a running commentary in your mind and be making kind of qualitative judgments on the quality and impact of the things being said. So this doesn't have to be a lot. Like, for context, the way I do it is I'll have a second column on a page I'm tracking. That'll be way smaller than the first. And I'll just kind of pen various thoughts I have. Whether it's that it's a contingent claim, or I'm just like, this doesn't make sense and seems a bit silly. Like, there only need to be a couple word thoughts at most. But having that kind of thoughts makes it much easier when you're coming to write the reply later on, that you've got things to refer to and thoughts that you've had you can bring back. And those probably are thoughts you'll be used in reply. And even if not, you can look and be like, oh, I don't know what I was thinking there. That's a bit silly. You can just ignore it. But it's good to have an idea as you're going through the debate about the specifics of what's happening. The second big piece of advice I would have, the later you start writing a reply is generally the better. So if you're a negative reply, ideally you start writing the reply at third affirmative. And obviously you're tracking before that point. You're tracking all the speeches. But is it when you physically start writing your reply on paper, I would suggest doing it later than earlier. And if you're feeling really ambitious, maybe it's like at a reply you start at third negative. I wouldn't suggest you do that. I'd really suggest you probably start at third affirmative still halfway through, but you can do that. And the reason why you want to start writing your reply later, like the reason why if you're first affirmative, you absolutely don't want to start writing your reply at the end of first negative, for example, is you want more information. And that's because, especially in Australs format, because you have replies, there's a bit more tolerance for new material at third sometimes. And that means the debate can pretty radically shift from the way a case has been given at first to the way it's been given at third. So the later you start writing the reply, the more accurate it's going to be to the debate by the end of the debate, as opposed to the debate as it started out in that first speaker exchange. So it gives you more information and will make you more adaptable. And that is generally a lot easier. The other thing I'll note there is like, especially if you're affirmative reply, having the third negative reply means the case can shift quite a bit. So even if you start writing, you want to be willing to kind of go back and add comments in or change things on the basis of what's happening in the debate as you see it. Like you don't want a reply to be really rigid. You want it to be nice and adaptable. The last two things I think about writing a reply in terms of advice are relatively straightforward. The first is try to step outside of your own point of view. I think a tendency of a lot of reply speakers, especially when they get started, is like, you get really annoyed that like someone doesn't respond to a really cool claim that you liked in your speech. So you want to spend a lot of time being like, I said this really cool thing and no one responded to it. And that becomes a large portion of your reply. Or as it's really commonly noted among first speakers, the reply is just like a repetition of like the first speaker speech they gave. That's not super useful because it just constrains your capacity to look at the reply, look at the debate from a more impartial lens and think about how to construct a reply that's going to maximally benefit your side. So don't get lost in the source too much, especially at reply. You want to try and not get sucked into the emotional narrative of debates too much. Step back, really look at what's happening on that analytical lens and try and observe things as they're happening in a way of like, what is actually happening? Because the more honest with yourself about how a debate is progressing you are, the more likely you'll be able to make the kinds of observations and judgments you need to reply to ensure that they'll really stick out. The last piece of advice I'm going to give is that you should write out replies word for word or pretty close to. This is not how I would encourage, or most people encourage you to do almost any other speech. The reason why it's important for replies, one, you've got a lot of time, but also a lot of reply is aesthetics. It's really, really important to make sure that when you're doing a reply, it's persuasive and it lands. And also, because you've only got 4 minutes, precision is really important. So if you've got a almost word for word, like 2 or 3 pages of how your reply is going to go, that can make your life much easier in sticking to time, making sure you deal with things effectively and keep it really clear. It doesn't necessarily need to be exactly word for word. My replies usually weren't exactly word for word, but certainly you should be writing a lot more for reply than you would for other positions that you might speak. So if you're doing an introduction at reply, absolutely that should be word for word. During the specific pieces of analysis you're giving, that are the most important bits of meta commentary, for example, those you'll probably want word for word. Exactly what balance you want depends on you, depends on what you're comfortable with, but I would certainly suggest a reply should be substantially more scripted than other speeches you would give, because you don't have time to ramble. You want to keep things concise and to the point. And kind of adding on to that, I would really suggest having timestamps and understandings of how long you want certain bits to do is really important. So when third negative, if they're in the dying breath of third negative in your negative reply, maybe you want to be like, okay, I've got 2 sections of this reply. I've got an introduction. That's not super important, take 30 seconds. And I've got 2 parts of the speech, but one of them is substantially more important than the other. Maybe it's like, great, I'll spend 2.5 minutes on this portion and only 1 minute on the other one, because it just isn't going to matter as much. Making those kinds of calls in terms of what parts of your reply are the most important, what's going to need the most time, and doing that beforehand helps keep your replies really efficient and means you won't miss things that are relatively important. Cool. You've written a reply. You've got all the content. Hopefully everything you have on paper is really good. How do you deliver a reply so that it lands maximally effectively? And I'll note, unlike most speeches, I think the aesthetics of a reply are super important. And that's partly what you're trying to do is very different at reply compared to other speeches, because you're not contributing the same type of content. And so because the nature of the content is very different, I think your style should be very different as well. And so one thing you'll note about a lot of speakers who speak reply, and you'll see this if you look at recordings, is often the way they speak a reply is very different to the way they'll give a substantive speech. So many of you see me speak, I'm usually very fast, I'm usually a little bit aggressive. With a reply, I will often really intentionally try to tone that right back, be much more slower, much more methodical, much more analytical. And that's actually a skill you kind of need to practice in terms of if you're trying to give your reply in a particular way, you often do need to work on maybe going against your natural patterns of manner in a way that might make the reply a bit more effective. And often having a really clear idea in your head, for example, I'm going to speak like this when I give the reply, can be really helpful. I will say, The norm of replies is that you give them in a very slow and measured way because it makes it clear and it is theoretically kind of more persuasive, makes you sound more reasonable to judges. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I've seen truly excellent replies that have been really aggressive, really loud, and really fiery. But I do think that norm exists for a reason. I think it generally is the type of reply that's most persuasive, though not always. But there are a diversity of approaches. I think many of them can work. So ultimately, it's about what do you find comfortable, what works for you, and what works for the debate. In a debate that's really complex and really messy, it's often helpful to be really slow, really analytical, and really precise. Whereas if the debate is much clearer, but it comes down, for example, to a couple questions of weighing or characterization, maybe that's where it makes more sense to be a lot more fiery and a lot more impassioned in your reply in a way that might be more similar to an aggressive substantive speech. There are two other things I think are really important when you are delivering a reply. The first thing is that you want to try and create a facade of neutrality and a position of authority. Because with any other position, right, when you're just trying to make content and prove claims, yes, you want the judge to believe you, but often they're believing you off the content of what you say. How you say it might impact it to a degree, especially if you're trying to make a more emotional claim, for example. But meta commentary, especially in terms of like whether you believe certain claims about what's important or what a debate is about, or whether you actually believe something is unproven or not. Those are the types of things that are much more kind of speculative questions, right? There's a lot more variety in terms of just like arguing, like, a set of mechanisms in a debate. And so you want to try and sound as authoritative and as objective as possible. And so the type of language you use is really, really important. I would avoid trying to use language that makes it sound like particularly partial towards your team. So for example, even just saying really simple stuff like our team, etc., is probably less persuasive than just being affirmative and negative, for instance. That can be something that's helpful in terms of just optics wise, making your reply sound more persuasive. And kind of like to less experienced judges, especially, it really does work and it does make your replies a bit more persuasive. The final thing is kind of what I've been harping about for a lot of today, which is that precision is key. But I mean that both in a linguistic sense, but also an analytical sense. So there's a lot of ways to make a reply sound better that are just very simple linguistic additions that make your life much easier. Things like when you're mentioning a claim or a piece of rebuttal, signpost and specify what speaker gave that material. So it'd be like, first affirmative gets up and gives you two clear reasons as to why this is super important. This is not responded to down the bench, except for a singular line of response at third negative, where they explain X. That often adds a lot more authority to the reply because it means that you're really clearly following the debate, and also makes it much easier for judges to believe what you're doing because they can look back through their own notes and verify that for themselves, or even just off memory verify those kinds of things. So that is one tip I'd highly recommend. Secondly, it's really helpful to assess the relative quality of different material. So one trick you'll see a lot of reply speakers do is you'll be like, we gave this point. The opposition had two responses. The first was this. This was really silly, and kind of give an explanation of how their team defeats it. And then you might be like, the second and far more sensible claim they make is this. And the reason why people do that is it's a little persuasive trick. If you're even to the opposition, like you're doing things like complimenting when they give good analysis and stuff like that, and explaining how you beat that out anyway, that makes you seem a lot more reasonable, but also adds a lot of importance to that, oh, yeah, that was clever, but you did still get around that kind of material. And very much so at reply, it kind of comes into what I talked about earlier, with you want it to be a way of convincing the judge could actually believe. So you get up reply and just be like, wow, the other team sucked and they're really terrible and they didn't say anything good at all. Like, unless that's actually true, which I would suggest very rarely it is, doing that type of qualitative judgments can be really helpful in terms of making the reply a bit more persuasive. The final thing is just being specific in harms. So in general, in language, when you're describing analysis and reply, you want to be as targeted and precise as possible. Don't be like if in the debate, another team gives a really specific way of how something might harm lower SES people. You don't want to just be like, they said it would harm lower SES people. Explain the specific ways they do that. And often, again, if a reply is trying to radically shift a judge's conception of the debate, the more specific you are in the way you describe that, the more likely it's going to work because you're not dealing in the types of ambiguities that will make them ask questions. You're being much more prescriptive and you're being very specific. So that tends to be very helpful. Cool. What we're going to do now is I'm going to give some general tips for reply, and then we're going to kind of talk about some more kind of, side effect stuff of reply. And then I guess after that, if you have questions, I'm happy to hang around. answer them. Bunch of tips to reply that I think are super useful that I'm just going to fire through. Firstly, you're not alone. Ask your teammates for help. This is really helpful for tracking and strategic direction. Because if you're putting the whole burden of doing a really good reply on yourself, that's much harder, especially if you've got more experienced teammates. Asking, for example, like, what do you think are the right things to focus on in reply? Or if, for example, you're speaking second, it can be really great for the person who's speaking first then. If you get them to track the speeches while you're writing your speech, and you can go look over at the notes that they wrote for tracking. And that can help incorporate you in the reply. Certainly something I did over my Australs run. And I think it's really helpful to the extent of if you're trying to get multiple perspectives of what you have in that reply, it's really, really helpful and it's going to make your life much easier. Also, as I will talk about a little bit later on, and I believe the next slide, if you reply, you should be talking to your third speaker a lot because that's really important. You two have a lot of kind of planning to do together, as it were. The second thing, as I said earlier, you want to be super explicit in what you're trying to accomplish and how you want judges to see the debate. So there's a couple things you can do that are really useful. The first thing that I think is really useful, call judges out on potential bias that might affect the way they're seeing debate. If, for example, you ran a principal argument, and you think that principal argument is genuinely debate winning, call out the judge on the fact that I know judges don't credit principles often, but this principle was well made and is really important. And so keep that bias in mind when you're evaluating this argument. Can be a way of making them reconsider that material. It's really good. Plenty of other ways you can do it as well. Calling out teams, for example, that might have more rep than you, but you seriously think you've beaten. It's often good to be like, hey, judge, don't use your rep calculator. Like, keep in mind, you're judging this debate on the quality of the content that's happened. Or if a judge has dispositions towards particular stakeholders. So, for example, like, judge, I know you might be, for example, predisposed to believing that more progressive ideas are generally beneficial, but this team has not actually explained how that impacts their stakeholders. We might not be as woke as they are, but like we've explained how this kind of like helps them win the debate really. Like our ideas are far more clear as to how they improve the lives of people, for example. Those types of calling out ideological biases, even to the extent of calling out things like biases like how fast or slow you speak, whether or not you're a kind of all WGM team, for example, that's often a helpful thing, or PSC team, that can sometimes be a helpful thing to call out on. I do note you want to be careful when doing this. You don't want to like attack the judge or make them feel bad. That's usually not a good way of winning debates. But in a very serious way, just be like, hey, you might be inclined in this particular way to do this. And often if you can kind of weave that in through comedy, that's really helpful. So for example, just like, yeah, I know we're not a team from a big name institution, but that doesn't mean that we were unable to understand like the economic nuances of this. And in fact, I'd go as far as suggesting that like they were the ones who didn't understand the depth of our analysis or stuff like that. Or like in the same way that sometimes ESL speakers will often kind of make those kinds of jokes and replies about accents, to call out judges and hey, just because I might sound a bit different, don't mistake that means my speech is worse in terms of quality. So that can be a useful thing to keep in mind. But I would obviously suggest don't overuse that. Time and place, keep it in mind, be discerning with it. The second thing is, and this is the really fun part of reply, calling out when other teams do really slippery things or try to debate in bad faith. Calling out, for example, when other teams strawman arguments, when they do really radical case shifts between first and second, if a team changes their model, like those are the types of things I would expect a judge in a debate where if I was in a debate and saw that happening, I would expect an OA to note that and call that out. In the same way, you should be doing that in your replies to be like, hey, judge, don't let them get away with this. And that often is really helpful in, again, sense checking and making sure that the way of judges perceiving the debate is the way that you want them to, but also in a way that's kind of fair and clean. And finally, I already kind of talked about this one, explicitly evaluating persuasiveness material is really helpful. The third thing is just charitability is really, really important. You want to try and avoid straw manning teams as much as you can. And to the extent you are uncharitable in points, you want to immediately follow that up by trying to be as charitable as possible. The best replies are always going to be the ones that are able to explain how, even when you're really nice to the opposition, you're still able to get around them. So for example, a lot of replies will start off with a sentence along the lines of like, this reply is going to be extremely charitable and assume that this team has proven all of the claims that they suggest, which isn't the case, but we'll assume it is. And we're going to tell you why still that is not enough for this team to win the debate. Those types of things can often signpost the judges that you're going to do that, in which case it perhaps makes it a bit more persuasive, assuming you actually are charitable. But also does just mean that it forces you to not do lazy analysis and do higher level analysis that is more like this stick. Other things you can do things like putting the burden on the opposition analytically. It's a really good way of avoiding having to give new rebuttal. So for example, if there's a particular claim they suggest, you can always be like, but you have to prove this and you failed to do that, or something like that. There's a really great, really well-cited example of old USU speaker Oliver Cummins doing this in the Nepal Australs round, where essentially what happens is third negative makes a claim in response saying that women sport players aren't going to get jobs in like certain types of things. And the way he kind of engaged back with that is as if we needed to prove that like women who are skilled in a particular field would get jobs in that field, which is a good way of being like making the judges be like, oh wait, they should have actually proved that thing. I realize I explained that example really badly, but you can watch the reply. It's quite good. The other thing is be aware what tools you have at your disposal. Because I think one thing that limits a lot of reply speakers is analytically not realizing they actually have a lot open and available to them. So doing stuff, for example, like calling out, bringing back unresponded material and whipping it, be like, they didn't respond to this, and it's super, super important for XYZ reason. Doing things like if you're affirmative, bashing the imperative. So being like, we set up this problem to you at first, really, really explicitly, and this team has no way that you can actually respond to it. That type of stuff is really useful as well. The final thing is just be flexible. Different debates will call for different styles of reply. Sometimes you want to reply that's really analytically dense and quite rigorous. Other times reply is a lot more about capturing vibes back and making it seem like you're winning the debate. So be sensitive to kind of how the room's feeling, what the vibes in the room seem to be like, and what you think is going to be the most persuasive strategy in getting the judge on side. Cool. Finally, let's talk about a little bit of other stuff about how replies affect debates. Firstly, there's a thing called negative block. So when third negative and negative reply are right next to each other, and that means you get 12 minutes of uninterrupted content. This necessitates that if you're on affirmative or negative, replies should be coordinating with their third quite intensively. If you're on negative, this means a couple of things. Firstly, the third negative can focus a lot more on rebuttal and less on summarizing the debate, and negative reply can focus really acutely on evaluating arguments. So one thing that's kind of different between third Easters and Australs is Austral style thirds tend to be a lot more rebuttal heavy because they don't need to do as much meta work because it can be done at reply, and that's especially true at third negative. Meanwhile, affirmative reply, you want to really think about countering neg block. Because in 12 minutes of uninterrupted content, a debate can shift quite radically. You want to really make sure that you're able to push back against any kind of shifts that can be made as much as possible. And so one thing in affirmative reply is you want to be really aware of if they're shifting or trying to move the debate and whip your strongest material back. So make it really clear that after the uninterrupted 12 minutes, the judge still knows what you said, why it's true, why it's persuasive, and calling out neg block on stuff it tries to do can also be really helpful as well. However, if you're negative, you obviously want to utilize this really well because it's a really powerful tool. Many people say that it makes the Australs format weighted towards negative. I would personally disagree, or at least disagree at the extent to which that's true. I think affirmative can be a very good place to be if you do things like topic select, right? So it's not something that I think you need to be overly worried of, but it's something you should be aware of, and it's something you should consider. Reply does have a couple impacts on third speeches, which is why it's really important you collaborate. Generally speaking, there's two tactics you can engage in between third and reply. Either you have very distinct focuses, so maybe like a third tries to focus on really pushing back against a team on the stuff that the other team's winning on, and does a bunch of rebuttal and stuff there. And then the reply might focus instead on the things you were already winning before that speech and whipping them a lot. So you can focus on two different areas of the debate between the two speeches, particularly at negative. Or, especially if, for example, the debate might be closer or there's less that matters in the debate and it's less broad, maybe you're going to focus on identical things and you're just going to push back on them together and make it super, super strong. Either one works, just depends on the debate. Just be intentional about which one you're going with. Thirdly, third affirmative goes before negative block. So often it's really important for third, maybe more so than otherwise. Make sure at the end of your speech you do a conclusion that leaves like a very strong and accurate impression of your case in the judge's mind, just so that can try and stick through as much as possible. Third negative kind of paves the way for reply very explicitly, so keep in mind they're going right after you, so that's kind of a bit of a 1-2 combo. Think about how you can go with that. And as I said earlier, unlike Easters, there's generally less meta commentary and analysis at third. You still have some, but just comparatively less. It shifts to reply a little bit more. Cool. How do you judge reply speakers? This is relatively straightforward, but I think it's worth explaining, so I'll go over it. Firstly, as a judge, it's always going to be easier to judge replies and debates as a whole if you have a good understanding of the debate before the reply. So you understand specifically what the reply is contributing to debate. Because if you have an idea of your mind of who is winning, why they're winning, how the debate stands before reply gets to speak, you can evaluate then, is reply being successful at changing my mind? Is it meaningfully impacting things? And understand what specifically a reply is contributing to the debate. That means you can probably score more accurately. Secondly, track replies very closely and very skeptically. Lots of speakers try to gaslight, engage in black magic at replies. You shouldn't do this. You should be smart and clever. So track very closely. Be skeptical of claims that replies make. Make sure that they're actually accurate to the debate and they're not just saying things that are convenient to make them winning. The other thing I would suggest is replies are obviously dependent on the material in a debate. Yes, it's true that you can give a very good reply even if you're losing the debate or even if your case is quite bad, but I would suggest that's a lot more difficult than if the debate was already very high quality and the cases were already very good. So keep in mind that it's difficult, although not impossible, for a bad case to be whipped into new life by a reply, but you might want to keep in mind whether they're successfully doing that or not. In general, you should consider how the reply specifically has impacted your perception of the debate. The reply has impacted quite a lot. It's probably a very good reply. If it kind of hasn't really changed your mind at all, it's probably a bit mid. In general, this is a quote from a Jordan Gibson Facebook thread. Again, I think it's very good advice. If material you hear at reply is material you wouldn't credit a panelist for suggesting as a rationale for a team winning, you shouldn't credit it in reply either. So again, as I said earlier in this talk, a reply is a bit like a panelist trying to bat for a team in a deliberation. If you wouldn't credit a panelist for suggesting that material, either because it wasn't in the debate or because it was entering or something like that, that's probably a good criterion for suggesting, well, that's not material that you as a judge should be persuaded by a reply either. But if it was, you probably should credit it. Cool. How do we get better than at giving replies? Firstly, you can choose not to. This, I think, is cringe. I think replies are really fun, they're really enjoyable, and they're a very unique skill and way to practice. They're kind of something unique to kind of Australs format and things similar to it. And I think it does work on quite a few different skills that might otherwise be a bit underdeveloped in a lot of speakers. So I think replies are fun. You should try and get the chance to work on them, even if you're maybe not speaking them in Australs, doing them like pre-comps or ad internals is a really good way of getting practice on them. Secondly, judging is a really great way to get good at reply because it, more specifically than the debating does, develops your strategic, it says institutions there, it's meant to say intuitions, but develops your strategic intuitions and perspectives, and that's the type of thing that's really important for a good reply. And if you can track debates really well as a judge and understand how things interact with each other, you'll be better at doing it on the bench during a debate, and that develops the type of intuitions and insight that are good for replies. The second is the classic practice replies, give more replies, ask for feedback. Those type, I think a lot of reply is actually kind of brute forcing the kinds of balance and intuitions you want. Like when I started my Australs run last season, I got a lot of feedback of like, your replies are summarizing too much. It's not clear what the strategy is for your reply, how your team's planning to win. Working that out over time, especially with replies because they're shorter, I think more commonly than other types of speeches, you tend to make the same kinds of mistakes as a speaker. Being really clear about what kinds of mistakes you make at reply, and if those are happening really commonly, is really helpful for then changing what you're going to do in the future and making your life much easier. The final thing is you can watch debates. You can watch replies in isolation, and I think this is like helpful and useful, particularly if you're just starting and you want to get an idea of what replies sound like. But whole debates are better to the extent that if you're watching a whole debate, you can understand why the reply is the way it is and how it's operating. However, that's a really long time. We have better things to do. So I would suggest watch replies online to the extent you can get an idea. You can just skip to the end, watch both replies, give an idea of what a good reply looks like, how, see if the team's won or not, what means it works. And then if you're in person judging internals debate or you're spectating or something like, or like spectating a debate to the comp or something like that, that's when it's useful to watch the whole debate and keep in mind and watch replies as a whole. Watching whole recorded debates is kind of boring, unless if you're like doing it while making breakfast or something, and then you're probably not getting as much utility out of it. Cool. Finally, here are some examples of good reply speakers. We're really blessed right now. Compared to like 3-4 years ago, there's a lot more recorded replies than there used to be. There's a wealth of recorded Australs debates from Nepal and Campbelltown especially. Many of them, especially in Nepal, have very, very high quality rooms and very good speakers. And so there's lots of excellent examples of replies there. Also, the ADC has lots of recordings from last year's pre-Australs comps on there. Like USU pre-Australs, UNSW pre-Australs, some others as well, I'm sure. And those all have replies and some really good examples there. And inevitably, there will start being recordings for this pre-Austral season relatively soon throughout June. So you can keep an eye on what other people are doing that might be useful. This is a very short list of people who I think are good reply speakers. The answer is I think the average Australian on a good team is actually a good reply speaker. I'm kind of the opinion from what I've seen, Australians are kind of disproportionately quite good at reply. And I think that's just because in general, got very strong senses of manner that translate very well over to reply compared to some other circuits. But in terms of who I think specifically is really good at looking at reply, Brendan Winters from Macquarie, I think is excellent, has a lot of great replies from the poll, especially that I think are highly worthwhile and worth watching. Jordan Gibson, also from ANU, I guess now UNSW and now graduated, also an excellent reply speaker. He's given a lot of stuff. Oliver Cummins from the USU, several others from the USU as well, Dan Yim, Bella Freeland, Brennan Chen, many of them are pretty excellent. Miko Vitung from Ateneo, and also David Africa, obviously both very excellent, very reputable speakers. They've also given really good replies. But in general, a lot of the time, if they're between names that you might recognize or from institutions that are relatively good, those are often people who are worth looking at who might give very good replies. Indeed, if you look at things like the finals of pre-Australs rounds, etc., basically every reply you'll hear there is very, very good. Would all be recommended. These are just some examples of people I think are relatively good. Also, there are some, although they're much harder to find, recordings of much older debates. So people like L. Jones and Jimmy Stratton, those replies are also really excellent, really good. I think if you want like the classic example of what a good reply should look like, the 2018 Australs Grand Final between USU and Macquarie. USU ultimately ended up losing the debate from the affirmative, but Jimmy Stratton, the reply speaker, gives a truly excellent reply, and that's a really good example of what a very clean classical reply might look like. There's also other reply seminars that break down things more in depth as well. And obviously, you can always message me on Facebook if you're like, Dan, do you have any examples of good replies? Because I've actually got several, and I can probably just send them to you. Other than that, that's all for the presentation. I realize it's been long. Hopefully it was interesting and you learned some things and that I wasn't too boring. Otherwise, I'm happy to take questions. Otherwise, thank you very much, everyone. Sam, I have no idea what's going on, but I can't actually hear you, even though your mouth was moving.
Right, is that any better now? Okay.
Yes, yes. I can hear you now.
Yeah, I have one. They answered a few slides ago, kind of. But so because you have the reply speaker, like with your team, does that kind of change the approach that like the rest of your team takes in terms of like what they include in their speeches? Like especially if they're
That's a really good question. My answer would be not super consciously. So I think it changes things in two ways. Firstly, I think it does change the bench dynamic a little bit because since you've got a speech that is happening after the third, Australs format, you'll notice people are a lot more switched on the bench. Like everyone's kind of writing things more, passing things between each other and sharing thoughts throughout the debate rather than just giving your speech and sitting down. Even if you're not the person speaking reply, because there's more work you can do, especially if the debate's looking like it's going to be very close. You could always pull it back at reply, kind of get the win. So I guess there's more engagement activity there. In terms of the second part about the content of the speech, it's not at all going to change how you do a first, and I would really say not at all going to change how you do a second. When it comes to third, I would suggest you're not going to leave things out per se, but sometimes it can be useful to prioritize certain things. So, for example, I wouldn't purposely leave out something knowing I have a reply after me, but maybe I would prioritize giving some rebuttal if I was running out of time in the speech, then giving some weighing, because I know the reply speaker could do the weighing, but they can't do the rebuttal. So I guess it impacts like your edge time decisions in terms of like, get the things out you have to get out in your speech that can't come out in the reply if something could come out in reply, but you're not changing it too drastically. Like in the end, even though the vibes of a third, Austral's third and Easter's thirds are a bit different, a good third is a good third in either one. And just keep in mind that because you've got the reply speaker afterwards, the kind of edge case decisions of what should I have and leave out in the speech become a little bit different. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, for sure. Did anyone have any other questions? No? Cool. No other questions from anyone else. So yeah, I think that's about good from us. Thank you so much, Dan. That was like
No problem.
really helpful.
Cheers. Well, hope you all have fun for the rest of internals. Enjoy yourselves. I've got to head off and write an assignment. But thank you very much, everyone. I'll see you all around at some point, I'm sure. Take care.
Thanks so much, Dan. All right.